Hey everybody, sorry, it took me a second. Um, as Mason said, I wish I was there in person with everybody to experience everything Raleigh has to offer. I've been to the conference a few times in the past and look forward to returning. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about open source practices and the concept of inner source to build more inclusive products. So my name is Dave Grizzanti. I am a senior principal engineer at Comcast, coming to you live from sunny Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So a little bit of my background, I've been an engineer for about 15 years, interested in engineering leadership and distributed systems. And I've recently become more interested in the intersection of open source communities and how we can use open source practices to build more diverse and inclusive working environments. So if everybody could think for a second, how diverse are your engineering teams? And think about not necessarily your whole company, but the specific teams that you work on. And I think we tend to work on small teams, especially in some companies nowadays, like the concept of a 2-pizza team. And with that, it's hard to necessarily get a broad, diverse team when our teams are necessarily small. And our tech trends and the way we build products today tend to reflect the people who are on those teams. Their perspectives and their experiences shape how our products are designed and built. And this can be from anything from a smart speaker to things like smart cities. So it's important that we think about how we can expand and focus more on building more inclusive products, even with small teams. Over the last probably year and a half, a lot of companies have focused on improving diversity, but really it takes time, especially when you want to see diversity at the highest levels of the company or in your engineering leaderships. And we also tend to blame the concept of the pipeline problem, lack of diverse folks in the pipeline. But that theory has been largely debunked. And in reality, we have biases in our hiring process. So we need to look at fixing our job descriptions, looking for talent in other locations, and really fixing our hiring processes. But this will take a while, and companies want to build more accessible and more inclusive products now. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do now to maybe create more inclusive products with the existing teams that you have. So how about we take this idea of looking at wisdom of the crowd, or looking at the resources that you have within your entire company, maybe not just within your individual teams. So all things open, the conference is a lot about open source, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, but some people may not be familiar with this concept of inner source. And open source and inner source are not necessarily the same thing, though they borrow a lot of concepts from each other. So let's dig into this idea of inner source a little bit more. So inner source is the use of open source best practices and the establishment of an open source culture, but within your organization. So your company may continue to develop proprietary software, but you can open the work between developers and teams internally. So sometimes people consider this like open source within the firewall. So simple things that you can do, like make your code public, meaning anybody can contribute. So code, documentation, testing. And when I say public, I mean public within your company. So for example, I work at Comcast. We have all of our source code in a single Git source control system, but the large majority of our code in those repositories is public, meaning that I can look at other teams' code. People outside the company can't, but I can see all those repositories. So how would this type of thing help with building inclusive products? Well, anyone in the company can help. If I have some free time, I can look at other outdoor projects. But projects can also gather volunteers from other teams or borrow engineers that may be able to help in certain areas that your team may be lacking in. So design, accessibility, et cetera. And teams can have incentives similar to open source projects for helping out, and the company can have a culture of celebrating contributions within the company. So what are some of the benefits that we see with open source or inner source? These are similar to benefits we see with open source projects. So documentation. Code is better documented, both in comments and less formally in discussions. So the more people looking at projects that you have internally, using them or just poking around, might contribute documentation fixes or see issues with your documentation and suggest fixes for you. Next, maybe code reuse. So code is more discoverable, projects are more discoverable. One of the big things that we do inside Comcast is make reusable modules for Terraform. So if I write a Terraform module for building something that's specific to the company, and this is on our Git repos, another team can take advantage of that because we're sharing this code, similar to being in the open source world, but for everybody across the company. Collaboration. So this will help help facilitate collaboration between teams as you kind of meet people in the company. Obviously, this is a lot different depending on if you have a huge company or a small company. But helping work on code helps with collaboration besides just simple networking or meet and greets. And the last thing is culture. So silos are broken down, happiness is improved. And I think being able to work on open source is seen as a big factor for people who will take a job at a certain company. But being able to work on inner source projects is also something that employees might like to do because they get to work on different languages, different projects, but you're still retaining talent and people are working inside the same company. So how can you go about adopting some of these inner source practices? What kind of things would you look at to take into account? So think about everybody can contribute. People tend to think of only engineers as people that can contribute to open source projects or contribute code in general, but their contributions can be things outside of code. They can be bug fixes, reports, copy edits, or even people using your software and giving you opinions about things that you may be lacking in the accessibility or inclusion space. So welcome everybody. Put this in your READMEs that anybody can help improve. Make it very easy for people to see how to make improvements or contribute back fixes. Second is establish maintainer roles. And this, again, doesn't have to necessarily be the engineer in charge of the project. It can be product managers, lead developers, or other key decision makers that are kind of elevated to manage these contributions coming in from the outside. And lastly, standardized tools and open projects. So I mentioned that at my company, we use a single Git server to manage all of our projects. So that's one thing that would help, use a single platform so that it's easy for people to discover projects to contribute to or find other people that they may be able to gather help from for their own project. So we talked a lot about inner source, what it is, some of the benefits and how to adopt it. But let's take a pause for a second and reflect on what we talked about so far. So following inner source can help more folks get involved, raise awareness of your project, maybe break down silos and give more folks the ability to contribute to more projects across the company. We're looking to open source practices for guidance and drawing on people with expertise in areas you need across the company. But inner source alone isn't going to fix your inclusion or accessibility problem in your software. It'll help to get more folks involved, but really we need some guidelines along with these inner source practices to follow to really make a difference. So what are some guidelines we can follow? So while I was doing research for this talk and just my general interest, I read a book by Kat Holmes called Mismatch, How Inclusion Shapes Design. And this is a quote from the book that she mentioned, which is, designing for inclusion begins with recognizing exclusion. So once you've recognized and accepted that exclusion occurs, you can see that this is a cycle. And habits that lead to exclusion can include using only your team's abilities. So we want to look at a few ways to eliminate folks feeling excluded during, while you're developing your software, but also as people use the software. So language matters. We know a little bit about using inclusive language. Mason's talk before mine mentioned using y'all, which I don't mention that specifically, but that's a very good example of something that would be more inclusive. So software terminology update-wise, one of the things that I know has become pretty popular that is still taking longer than I thought to change was renaming master branch domain, deprecating terminology. So instead of using whitelist and blacklist, use allowed or blocked. Same for black box testing, open, closed, and master machine nodes become controller. And on the topic of gender inclusive language, the Linguistic Society of America defines inclusive language as language that acknowledges diversity, conveys respect to all people, sensitive differences, and promote equal opportunities. So generally, we've become accustomed to not to gender specific pronouns. So the use of guys, that is not great to use. So y'all is a good replacement, as Mason mentioned, but just generally being more aware that using gender neutral terminology is better. I tend to use folks a lot, which can get overused. So just try to mix it up, but just be aware. Using preferred pronouns is another great example. So this is much about making your coworkers and peers feel inclusive. This is about making sure your documentation and examples use proper pronouns. And using individuals' correct pronouns in the workplace is a powerful affirmation of self for gender and gender nonconforming individuals. Validates one's identity and encourages authenticity. So I didn't actually do this at the beginning of my talk, and I did have a note to say that, but to introduce yourself with your pronouns to make folks feel more comfortable sharing, even if it's not something that you think would apply to you necessarily. The more people that do it and make it seem like a normal practice, the more it will become standard. So maybe put pronouns in your email signature, things like that. My profile on our Slack internally has my pronouns on it. And I have some references at the end I'll share for more on this. And then lastly, let's talk about building some practices within your organization. So design with excluded and diverse communities, not for them. So this is something that we tend to do is, we're going to make this product and we're assuming what these communities need. So make sure to involve them if you can. Maybe you're building a product for a community and you can involve folks from the community to help you get feedback or build the product. Maybe consider compensating them if that's something that your company can offer, or building some kind of community with the members to help. Foster belonging through representation. So reflect on whether or not your product privileges or tokenizes certain communities or cultures as a starting point, and avoid system defaults to make assumptions about people's identities or force them to categorize themselves while they're using it. Next, strengthen culture, training, and processes within your organization. So staff diverse teams if possible and support them through tools and processes that scale inclusion. This could look like continuous education and training, such as bias busting linters or plugins that offer alternative language proposals. So one of the common ways I've seen this in something like Slack is if somebody says a term that doesn't reflect something your company is looking to include, it'll respond back. So if you say, hey guys, Slack will say try to use a more gender neutral pronoun. Establish accountability in the organization. So performance review time or measurable inclusion goals as you build your products and plans for product teams. And normalize inclusion at a system level. So not just your engineering teams, but really the leaders need to make an example of this by highlighting case studies of inclusion inside the organization and showing that teams are making an effort to do a better job at this. So let's start to wrap up a bit. So acting together is something that we all can do. So some of the practices we looked at were adopting inner source within your organization, learn from examples in the open source communities, take those back internally with the products you build. Designing for inclusion starts with recognizing exclusion, use inclusive language, and build with excluded individuals and communities, not for them. So I've got a slide here with some resources, this one, the next one. So this is a resource for the Inner Source Commons, which is doing a lot of great work in the space of inner source. They have community calls and conferences. They're really inviting Slack channel if you're looking for more references of either how to get involved with inner source or how to adopt it within your company. They have some patterns you can follow, things like that. And then lastly, this is a list of resources and references that I used while building this talk. Inclusive language guide from Northwestern, pronoun guide from Out and Equal, a study on the GitHub team gender from GitHub teams that I didn't go into specifically, but it's worth looking at, and a few others. And that's it from me. Thanks, everybody. I included my Twitter handle in here if you have any questions or want to chat or learn more about any of these topics.